Hello Stat 200 and welcome to the Lesson 1 overview video. This week you're going to be learning about collecting data. I'm Dr. Zimmerman. I coordinate a lot of the instructional materials across multiple sections of Will Campus Stat 200. I make the weekly overview videos and I also teach one section of the course. Each video typically starts off with a list of key topics. This week is all about vocabulary. This is very different from all of the following lessons. This week, you'll be learning a lot of vocabulary terms and how to apply them to different research scenarios. In this video, we're going to go over the key vocabulary terms that are most important this week. These are the ones that you should have memorized by heart because you'll be applying them in almost all of the remaining lessons. First, we'll define the term variable. We'll be talking about variables all semester. We'll distinguish between categorical and quantitative variables. Often, the procedures that you perform or the graphs that you make are dependent on whether the variables that you're working with are categorical or quantitative. We'll also distinguish between explanatory and response variables. I'll introduce statistical inference, and we'll distinguish between independent and paired samples. Before we go over these vocabulary terms, I want to talk about a few strategies that you can use specifically in Lesson 1, because Lesson 1 has a lot of vocabulary terms. These first two strategies you should use every week. Read the online notes and textbook and ask questions on the discussion board. You should take full advantage of the course discussion boards. This is a great place for you to interact with other students in the course and your instructor. This week, you may also want to make flashcards for the vocabulary terms. At the end of Lesson 1 in the online notes, there are some online flashcards available. If you've taken a statistics course before, you may just want to run through these online flashcards to make sure that you remember all of the vocabulary terms. If you've never taken a statistics course before and all of these terms are new to you, I recommend printing out the list of vocabulary terms with definitions and making your own flashcards by hand to practice with. The act of making the flashcards can help you learn the terms as well. You should study the relations between the terms. So for example, categorical and quantitative are terms that go together. Explanatory and response are terms that go together. And independent and paired samples are terms that go together. And also every week, complete the optional practice problems in Wiley+. So in addition to your required homework assignment in Wiley+, you should also see an assignment that says Lesson 1 Practice Optional. These practice problems are not graded, but I strongly encourage you to at least go through a few before beginning the real homework assignment. Now, let's go through those vocabulary terms that I showed you on the last slide. First, variable. A variable is a characteristic that is measured and can take on different values. In other words, it's something that varies in a research study. This is in contrast to what we would call a constant. A constant is a characteristic that is the same for everyone in a research study. Usually, in statistics, we're concerned with variables. We want to look at the relations between variables, or we might want to look at differences between different groups on a certain variable. Variables can be categorized as categorical or quantitative. Categorical variables have groupings, in other words, categories. They have no meaningful order of magnitudes, or they have a meaningful order of magnitudes with unequal intervals. For example, rankings. These are also known as qualitative variables. A quantitative variable has numerical values with consistent intervals. In other words, the difference between 1 and 2 is the same as the difference between 3 and 4 or 5 and 6. These are also known as numeric or interval ratio variables. Here are a few examples of each. For categorical variables, we have biological sex. This is measured as male or female. Undergraduate or graduate student status. These are two different categories. Academic major. And finally, baseball team rankings. Rankings often confuse students because they usually take on numbers, but the difference between those numbers is not equivalent. So the difference between the first and the second place team is not necessarily the difference between the 10th and 11th place team. So rankings are considered categorical variables. For quantitative variables, height in inches, weight in pounds, and exam scores are three examples that you're going to see often in this course. The number of games won by a team is also a quantitative variable. Within our research study, we can have an explanatory variable and a response variable. We have an explanatory and a response variable when we use one variable to predict or explain variation in another. In those cases, the explanatory variable predicts differences in the response variable. Or we could say that the explanatory variable explains variation in the response variable. Down below, we see the explanatory variable is also known as the independent variable or the predictor variable. A response variable is also known as the dependent variable. A lot of textbooks use independent and dependent variable instead of explanatory and response variables. These are just synonyms. Much of what you're going to do in this course centers around statistical inference. So I believe starting in lesson 4, we're going to start looking at statistical inference. We'll look at confidence intervals, and then we'll look at hypothesis testing. In both of these cases, we're taking a population, we're using a sampling method, and you'll also read about sampling methods this week, to obtain a sample. A sample is a subset of the population. We use that data from the sample to make an inference about the population. So in many cases, it's not possible for us to obtain measurements from everyone in the population because it's a very large group typically. So we just obtain data from a subset of the population, the sample, and we use that sample data to make an inference or conclusion about the population. And the last set of terms that I want to talk about this week, independent and paired samples. Independent samples are completely separate groups that are in no way matched or paired with one another. Paired samples are related groups where each observation in group A is paired with an observation in group B. These are sometimes also called matched samples or matched pairs. These are often the same person. So for example, I could take your midterm exam score and your final exam score, and they would be paired by student. It's also possible to have paired samples that are different people. So for example, if we're looking at heterosexual married couples, we could compare husbands to wives. Each husband is paired with his wife. You could look at mother-son pairs. In that case, every mother would be paired with her son. Whether you have independent samples or paired samples is going to change the graphs that you make and the analyses that you do. So these are terms that you're going to see throughout the semester as we're talking about different analyses and different graphs. This concludes the Lesson 1 overview. This was not meant to cover all of the topics in Lesson 1. If you read through the online notes, you'll see there's quite a few topics that I didn't even touch upon here. The ones that I choose for the lesson overview videos are those that you're going to see in subsequent lessons. So these are the ones that I really want you to emphasize this week because you're going to need to apply these terms in almost all of the remaining lessons. If you have any questions, please post them to the Lesson 1 discussion board on Canvas, contact your instructor, or ask one of the Penn State Learning Tutors.